Palingenesis by Simon Hereward. Book 3, Heart of the Sear. Chapter 3, The Dungeons of Merric. There was a man in his cell, even with his eyes shut tightly, swimming up from the deep well of his dreams. Gareth was aware of the presence of another, a shadow falling over him as he lay huddled in the sacking. Janos, he thought, and tried to speak the name, hope stirring inside him like the glow before the sunrise. He must have made a sound, for there was laughter, harsh and cruel, and when he opened his eyes it was only to see the mocking form of Gobran and one other he did not know. Words tumbled down upon him.
"Don't waste the water. That collar is done for him."
"We don't need to come back here. Just leave him for the rats."
A lantern was shoved into his face. Fingers gripped his torn shirt and lifted him for a closer examination. Again Gobran's laugh sounded in the cell.
Oh, my, what a sorry sight. And old Tsar thought him so dangerous. Now look at the great Viran, the princeling from Nuria.
There was a pause. The man that was not Gobran spoke up again.
"Do you think he is? The queen?"
Of course he is. Why else would he be collared? Why else does she spend so much time asking him questions? If he was just another Viran boy, would they keep him here and not feed him to the Ronings?
He poked Gareth in the chest, causing him to take in his breath.
No, it's the one they were looking for. It's only that Lord Horan is no more use for him, and the Queen has grown tired of his stubbornness.
Gobran let go of his shirt, letting him fall back on the sacking.
He is of no use to anyone now.
He rose up to go. The other man rose with him, taking hold of the heavy pail. At the door of his cell, Gobran turned round and bowed low.
Your Majesty.
They laughed and slammed the cell door. The heavy bolt slid into place. Gareth lay back and placed his hands under his head. He was grateful not to sit there soaked and shivering once more. If they had meant to be cruel by withholding the freezing water, it certainly seemed more like a kindness to him. He drew up his knees with an effort. The muscles across his back protested sharply, sending a spasm through his entire body to linger finally in the nape of his neck, where the collar had been fastened. He felt the tearing of his skin, dull and painless, and the flow of warm blood pooling between his shoulders. Gobran was right. The collar was doing for him. It would not be long. The rats would scurry into the cell through the grating, up the furrow, over the stone floor. He rolled over onto his stomach and raised up on all fours. There was something he had to do. With an armful of rags torn from his bedding, he crawled over to where the furrow disappeared into the wall. Into the hole it went, as tightly as he could stuff it, between the iron bars. The rats would have to enter here, and he would make it as difficult for them as possible. He knew they would pull out the sacking again in time, but perhaps he would be dead by then, and would not be eaten while still able to feel anything. The morning meal was in place, waiting for him. He took his time with it, rolling the rough gruel around in his mouth before swallowing each morsel. He cared not for the taste, but enjoyed the sensation of ingesting sustenance, even though he knew it was insufficient to fortify him against a growing weakness. There was a large fleshy vegetable with his bowl. Tull, Janos had called it. He blessed the nameless jailer who cared not for its taste or texture. It was moist and large enough to still the cramps inside him, a satisfying meal by itself. If only they would bring him more water. He used all his allotment to swallow the gruel, leaving him parched for the rest of the day. It was a relief that his weakness pressed him into sleep for the greater part, and he had to struggle with the thirst for but a few hours. This day there was to be no such reprieve, however. Somewhere during the afternoon the bolt rattled and the door swung open. Figures appeared against the dim light of the torches outside. A familiar mocking voice reached for him.
"Come along, great one. Time to show your face upstairs."
It was Gobran again, come to drag him from his cell. What could be the reason? Surely they did not have more questions for him. A man leaned over him and another prodded him with his foot.
Does he breathe still?
"He does."
Hands gripped him, and he was picked up like a basket of vegetables. One of the guards draped him over his shoulder, and they set off for wherever they were taking him. Queen Elena of Tirallon walked among the engines of torture, touching each one in turn. The semi-dark hid from sight the scars caused by the fell use of many cycles. What they had seen, these structures of nightmare that should never have been fashioned. It was the hardness of men, the fearful resolve that would not yield till the consummation of every dark dream. This had necessitated such implements. Cale had to fall. He had to be broken, as it were, from the prison in which he had enclosed himself. There was no other way, she believed, that he would ever be free of his pride, his potential to dominate. How else would his ears ever be opened to her voice? How else could he be made to realize that her regrets were real, and what she said not merely the pleading of a desperate, defeated, and disgraced traitor? He would make things right, the boy had said. Could it be possible that it was truly so? And what things? Only the summoning? Or all the wrongs of the past? Had he really changed? Did he even appreciate what he had lost? Had he any understanding of the utter dejection that had made her vulnerable to the approaches and guile of the shadow? Was her betrayal merely seen as a result of her supposed innate fickleness and infidelity? He had seen it all before. They slumped him in the same chair, in front of the same little table with the same lamp on it. He looked around for Immos, but the big man was nowhere to be seen. That was a relief. Though he suspected they no longer meant to blind him, the horror of that suggestion still lingered. He did not want to die in complete darkness. The queen approached from where she had been waiting in silence as soon as they settled him. Gareth was almost surprised to see her. It seemed so long since she had taken any interest in him. Would she still be after the little he knew? What else could bring her down to the decay of the dungeons? She sat down without a word and proceeded to stare at him. Perhaps he was dirtier or more ill in appearance than before, for when at last she spoke, there was a trace of concern in her voice.
"Can you hear me, Gareth?"
His name sounded strange when she spoke it. He merely nodded in reply, raising his eyes to hers. Immediately he felt the pressure of her thoughts in his mind. He ignored the pain flowing from his neck to his temples, and dropped his gaze to his hands. Elena shook her head, smiling.
"You still resist me, even when what you may tell me will not matter to Lord Merric any more."
Gareth blinked up at her, this queen of ambiguity. Was it true what she said? Did it really not matter any more what he told her? It was impossible to trust anything she told him. Yet a little of her true thought, willingly or no, spilled over into him.
"He does not know who you are. I have not betrayed you to Lord Merric."
This, at least, had to be so. The master of Merric had not come to claim him. This queen was keeping a secret from her lord. The pressure ceased abruptly.
"Have it your way."
Elena shrugged.
"I will ask you directly, and you may answer when you will."
He knew it was not the whole truth. She meant for him to tell her all he could. Now that the collar had performed its mischief, she believed he would not resist for long. It was disturbing that he could see all this in her expression alone. Could she see the same in his eyes when he spoke? Or was it that she wanted him to see it? Elena was in a strange mood, reckless and desperate for the lifting of every mask. Too long she had suffered the illusions of her existence to ensnare her senses, her understanding, the longings of her soul. She needed at long last to be free of it all, or lose herself forever in the layered falsehood.
You said before that Cale knows about the beast, the monster bred in the Southland.
Her voice seemed to reach for him from a great distance, slowly reeling in his struggling thoughts.
Does he mean to face it? Will Cale try to destroy Malic's perversion? Or has he found someone who can?
Gareth took in his breath silently. He tried with all his might to keep his expression veiled. Please, he thought, please let him not pursue this course. Please let him not discover his only secret. Elena waited for a contradiction, an acknowledgment, even an expression of disinterest. When the boy's face remained blank, she realized she was close to the truth. She continued as if he had corroborated her surmise.
Who is it? One of his captains?
She shook her head, smiling.
No, none of them would be fool enough to try. Ah.
Her eyes opened wide.
Could it be the exile? Did he win over the erstwhile master of the arena to face what he cannot?
Gareth felt the ground move underneath him. It could not be true. She could not know this. The voice droned on.
I am correct? If I am, Lord Malic ought to have been furious about him slipping away, not once but twice, from the palace here in Lakeside and from the city of Munborg.
She actually laughed.
But he does not know. How could he?
The queen turned her gaze back to him.
He does not even know about you. Not a thing.
The flicker lit up her eyes.
Father and son remain beyond his reach.
Gareth could not keep the startled expression from his face. Again there was the ringing of her laughter. Through his dismay, he realized it was a pleasant sound, almost like the song of a bird, and not spiteful as he would have expected it to be.
Oh, they could not uphold that silly lie beyond the borders of that kingdom of fools. Lord Malic is aware you are not Fengor's son, but he also remains ignorant of the fact that he has Rune and Aethera's son right here in Merric, locked in his prison.
She seemed to be looking at something beyond him now. He almost turned his head to look behind him. Her voice was thoughtful.
The joining of the lines.
She turned her piercing eyes back on him.
Could you be the child of the lament?
Bewildered, he met her gaze for the first time.
You know the lament?
The words were out before he could think. His voice was hoarse. He reached up for his throat but did not touch it. She kept staring at him, intoning the words locked in his memory.
Hide him from the hooded man, a baneful child, in whose unnamed birth the ancient lines are reconciled.
Her smile had faded. She turned her eyes away from him.
How sad it would be. You are to die in this place, far away from the... far away...
A little frown creased her brow. Her manner changed abruptly.
Could it be that I am the one to hide you from him? The hooded man? Do you know that is what they call him in the Fez? The stars that form the destroyer here in Lakeside, or what you call the dragon's body in Viron, and the blind man of Erin, he's called the hooded man in the desert lands. And that is the essence of Malic, his great love for the masquerade, the power and advantage to be gained from deceit. Yet he has now betrayed that certain strategy for the brute strength of a beast.
Gareth heard the voice droning on. Elena spoke as if she had forgotten his existence, perhaps as she had longed to speak in confidence to an ally or friend she never had.
The fearful creature your father saw in the dank wood is but a pet compared to the consumer himself. He's waiting for Cale, you see, waiting for one final confrontation in Nuria, where he may be avenged for all those long bitter cycles. The death of Turin, the overthrow of the beast in the time of Fenwith, the humiliation of fleeing into these dreary lands for refuge. He will be avenged at any cost, even at the cost of his own blood, his own issue, fallen into the half-life of monsters.
Her eyes betrayed her as she mentioned them, the twisted creatures known as Ronings, failed perversions of Malic's dark path to power. She was horrified that such sacrifices were required for the sake of one's ambition. These had been brought into being by the Lord of Tirallen, her chosen master, who would conceal their existence from her. All of her skill and energy she had poured into honing his minions, his forces arrayed against Viron. Was this the ultimate face of that power? The face of an insatiable and uncontrollable beast? It was a severely sobering thought. As the silence lengthened, Gareth noticed something of her inner struggle, and for the first time saw a touch of terror in her countenance. She shook free of the trembling reverie, and her mask slipped back into place.
So, you see, there is no harm in revealing to me what the old man has in mind. There is no way for him to triumph. Even if Lord Malik was told, he would not alter his plans now. He is supremely confident, and with good reason. There is no thwarting what he has set in motion.
What was he to say? Should he tell her that Kael planned to face Malik himself? He had no talent for lies. She would know his intentions immediately. Did he dare tell her part of the truth, that Kael had meant to persuade Rune but had failed? That there was no champion now for the Viron cause, and that the lands of the inland sea would be crushed under Malik's heel? That was what she had wanted to hear, was it not? Why then had he struggled to keep his secret, if now he would let it slip just for the asking? She was cruel as her master, and could not be trusted.
Tell me, Gareth, what is in his mind? Why did he let you be taken?
He shook his head against the pain in his members and the agony in his mind. It was not true. Kael had not allowed him to be taken. He would not betray the old man now.
I cannot.
Elena merely sighed.
I am sad that you will not give me this one confidence. I am not the enemy you believe me to be.
She leaned forward suddenly.
Let me grant you one favor, Gareth Sethrun, before you go back. Is there something you desire?
He had not long to think of what he wanted.
Water. Please, let me have some water.
The mask moved for a moment, and he saw her true feelings. She did feel pity for him, and would not have him suffer out of spite. And there was something else, something she was desperate to suppress.
Of course.
She had them bring him a large earthen jug with a cup. He did not bother to pour, but gripped the jug with both hands. The water was cool and musty, and he thought he would never get enough of it. He let it dribble slowly over his chin and down onto his chest, till at last he tilted back his head and felt the flow of his blood down his spine where the spike entered his skin. It was an odd sensation, as if there were a hole in him through which the water was leaking out. He did not care, though, for he could pour it in quicker than the leeching wound could steal. Elena watched him in silence. Again there was a flicker of pity in her eyes, a twinkling of regret. When at last he lowered the jug and sighed in satisfaction, she smiled wanly, a little smile of farewell. The queen nodded to his guards, who helped him to his feet. Gareth felt sure he would not see her again. An inexpressible sadness took hold of him, but he smiled in return, gripping the edge of the table to keep from sagging back into the chair. She watched him leading him away back to his prison, and the same sadness spilled over into her. Would that they had never brought him here. All the events of her too long life had come to a head. It was the climax, the season for finality and resolution, and this child had come to force her through the struggles and regrets that ought to have been decided and buried. There he went, little Veer, with a stain of blood slowly spreading over the back of his ragged shirt, and she had wounded him, yes, wounded him to death. And now she would stand by and watch and shed her tears and do nothing. Deliberately, like a stalking adversary, the loneliness closed in on her again. The stone marker was real enough. the gray-white speckled surface rough and cool beneath his fingers. Slowly he traced the letters and markings there, directions to far-off places where Imran's orb hung in the brilliant blue sky. The paleness above the trees seemed to brighten at the thought, and then he noticed the letters in the center. It was in the older language, but he knew what it said. Limit not your soul. Fear not the darkness. He could hear it in his thoughts, the intonation of a familiar voice. The old man was with him, reaching out to him.
I am glad you found your way here again, though I understand not how.
It was a great comfort just to hear. He could listen and be content forever. A suspicion rose up in him.
Am I dead? I feel no pain.
No, you are still alive. You would be a mere shadow passing through here if you were dead. But it will not be long now, and you will lose your substance. This is a relief to you?
The boy nodded slowly, uncertainly.
I may tell them a secret if I stay, but I want to be alive. I want to live.
The man smiled wryly.
You understand little about living. But why stay in this place? Here you only have hurt. Living here is pain.
The boy stared unseeingly, his eyes overlarge.
I saw him turning. He turned, but it was a dream only.
It was not. He has turned back for you. He is coming for you if you will go back.
There were many memories. The face of a king, a brother, a mother. Then the warrior, clouded angry in the whirlpool of his hurt and hate in that dank city on the sea. Living was treacherous and suffused with pain, yet stronger than these was the yearning that made him choose.
I want to be there when he comes.
The old man put a hand on his shoulder. His touch was warm and invigorating. Perhaps it would not be so bad to return. The whisper echoed oddly as the ground beneath him moved away again.
You will have to be strong.
His limbs were oddly stiff. Across his back and chest also was an inexplicable tightness. The sharp pains had gone. In their place was a dull throbbing, as if the beating of his heart brought too much pressure pulsing into his bruised body. It was cold. The stones of the floor pressed grimy hands against his skin. They had not bothered to drop him onto the sacking. Perhaps they expected him to die. He opened his eyes. Nothing had changed. There were the iron rings in the opposite wall like gaping mouths, always astonished that he was here still and alive. Beneath them lay the rotten sacking, the furrow, the small hole with its iron bar and putrid smell. But there was no jug, and no hunk of black bread. Immediately the raging thirst surged through him again. He lifted his head and croaked in agony as the fire flowed down his arms, over his shoulders and back. He sensed the fresh flow of blood and tasted it in his mouth, where he had to have bitten his lip. Instinctively he knew that they would not come for him again. They had flung him back in there to die. In the night she came into his cell, though he had not noticed the door opening. It was the queen, half shadow, half light. She was leaning over him, but he could not rise up or even lift his gaze to look at her face. He imagined she reached out a hand to touch his hair. There were words too, but he could not catch the meaning. He was not strong enough. He could not endure to be found here. Despite the old man's assurance, the dream would remain a mocking shadow. Rune watched the gray sky clear to let the early stars peer down on him. He remained in concealment till the eyes of Lauren were bright in the black dome above. The vast encampment outside the walls was a sea of firelight and moving shadows. The clamor of voices, the rough laughter of gambling, drinking men rose into the night, diverting the attention of whoever might be patrolling the walls and perimeter. Not that the guards posted here would have any reason to be on the alert. Everyone knew there could not be an enemy within 100 miles of Lakeside. When at last it was sufficiently dark to make the attempt, he slipped from the cover of the shrubs. Trusting that there were no sharper eyes than those of the marshland men watching, he flitted from shadow to shadow, working his way to the wall. He had donned a short black hooded cape and gloves, though the night air was not very cold. His blade was concealed inside the cloak where he could easily reach it. If he wore it on his hip, it would inhibit his movements, especially with the amount of climbing and crawling he would have to do. He skirted the wells of light where Malic's warriors played their raucous games, choosing a section of wall in deep shadow. The fortifications of Merric were a sham. Its real potency was hidden beneath the surface of the raised swamp. In the festering heart, Malik kept his secrets and the people of his choosing to bring them out into the open only when he could no longer be resisted. The moat was almost dry still, before the great rains, and easy to traverse. The wall was mostly constructed from packed mud, cast in great blocks and allowed to dry. There was a wooden palisade at the top, adding another 3 or 4 feet, for a total of no more than 10. Such a fortification would never keep out the type of creatures he had glimpsed in the fenlands of the Vadrum. So much greater than the mystery, if one did not know better, of the escape of this place and its people from the swarms of old.
What possible reason could someone like Malik Yulian have for desiring the downfall and destruction of Muria?
Halterd's words, in the palace of her father in Aruis. Was there anything left of it now? She had suspected then, as was unquestionable now, the designs of this madman, and how deep that madness ran, to the harnessing of power that corrupted life itself and rose up against anything natural and pure. All dark dreams led there, he thought, and mine would have made no less a monster of me. In silence he waited for the roaming guard on top of the wall to pass, then looped his rope round one of the sharpened stakes of the palisade. He took a deep breath. The great gamble had begun. He hardly needed the rope in the end. Once on the inside of the wall, he simply unhooked it and hid it under the walkway suspended from a protruding nail. There was no need to hide now, but he kept his face concealed under the hood and kept to the shadows, avoiding the traffic on the streets. Even at this late hour, people seemed animated in their conversation and energetic in their actions. There was a carnival atmosphere in Lakeside. The folks here had to be aware of the great scheme of their master and its present unfolding far to the north. The dullest soul here had to realize events of some magnitude were about to unfold, simply judging by the number of warriors gathered in and around the city. Rune would let them have their celebrations, premature or no. He had no more business with Malik and his followers. There were curious glances in his direction as he made his way to the slave market. Once a man called out to him, but he ignored the greeting and hurried on past as if accosted by the unwanted approaches of a beggar. The streets were still crowded with schemers and vagrants of all kinds, hoping to profit from the crowds of foreigners in some way. A dirty, ragged child tugged on his sleeve as he pressed through a throng at the gateway to the market square. He shrugged the urchin off roughly, almost sending him sprawling. An angry shout followed him, probably from the boy's handler. Rune cursed them under his breath. He could not afford to draw attention to himself. There were several warriors in the crowd. Whether any of these were guards on duty, he could not tell. 2 more urchins appeared in front of him, their manner suspicious. The persistent handler was still shouting, making his hands itch to run the blade through the slug's belly. The brats did not make way for him to pass, and he had to shove them out of his way. He felt a hand slip under his coat. Cut purses. They would be disappointed he carried no coin this night. With an effort, Rune restrained himself from sending them on their way with a kick. Let them swallow their failed expectations in silence this time. They would be cuffed and kicked enough by whoever owned them. Surprisingly, there was still some trading going on in the square. Malik's need for slave deportations to the east was at an end. The unusual demand had ceased, and business had to have slowed down considerably. Even so, the specimens on display were not of high quality. Not that one would expect prime captives in a cesspool like the common slave market of Lakeside. Yet the spindly, rag-dirtied wretches in the public cages were so miserable as to turn up the nose of the lowliest buyer. Rune mingled for a while with the disgruntled onlookers, pretending interest in the paltry wares. Slowly he moved through the crowd, working his way to the center of the square, where a walled-off section allowed entrance to the underground holding pens. He fervently hoped that the gateways in the slave cavern were still as yet left him on his last visit to Lakeside. There was no other access to Merric's subterranean warren that he knew of. It would take valuable hours searching for an alternative. Ere long he was within a yard or two of the entranceway. The smell he recognized immediately: rancid straw, unwashed bodies, and the sour reek of decaying vegetables fed to the inmates. The heavy iron gate barring entrance into the passage beyond stood open. The large figure of a guard, his back turned, lolled inside it on a low stool. When he believed no one was watching, Rune quickly stepped into the deep shadow of the wall. The inside was only dimly lit by a single torch 10 paces down the passage. He glanced at the heavy key ring at the man's belt. With any luck, the same fellow would be here when he returned. The cells close to the gate appeared to be empty. There was no one to give him away to the sprawling, silent form of the watchman. He stepped inside and walked down the passage noiselessly, his fingers gripping the hilt of his blade. A prickling settled in the small of his back in anticipation of the guard's challenge. It never came. He rounded a corner. Movement and coughing in a dark cell gave him a start. He hurried past it to the gaping doorway leading to the underground. Carefully, he peered through into the large cavern beyond. It was dimly lit, as he remembered, by widely dispersed wall lamps. The majority of the cages were in deep darkness. There appeared to be no one moving about. There would be little enough reason for anyone to be present here at this time. The feeding of the slaves would be long past, and apart from the few wretches outside, they would have settled down for the night. In a moment he slipped inside and pressed his body against the dank stones of the inner wall. He waited breathlessly, but no voice spoke from the dark to challenge him. No unseen form had noticed his silhouette against the open doorway. His eyes adjusted quickly to the murky darkness among the cages. He recalled the location of the large one next to his gate of entry. He remembered also the pitiful inmate to whom he had given the keys when passing through. She was no longer there, the little girl, and he wondered if she had found her way out, perhaps in the company of others, to flee Lakeside and the terrible fate planned for her. The chain and lock were still in place on the disused gate. The former was stronger than he remembered, but of iron and not steel. It proved to be a blessing that the adjacent cage was empty, for he had some work to do on the chain before it would separate. Wrapping the cold weight in his cloak, he attacked it with a file brought for the task, moving the implement but an inch at a time. It was an agony of grating noise and slow progress, since he had to glance about him every so often to keep watch. No huddled bundle of rags shifted, no miserable form rose up to pay him any attention. Rune sighed in satisfaction when the link he was working on parted at last. It had cost him perhaps half an hour, but the need for swift passage once he had found the boy could prove great. Though he could have scaled the gate as before, it was worth the risk to force his way through now. He had little idea what state Gareth would be in. In all probability he would have to be carried. Clambering over spiked gates with such a burden while being pursued would be a daunting and dangerous undertaking. He lifted the gate slightly before opening it to prevent any noise. It was heavy and swung open with difficulty. There was little sound, though, and he slipped through with ease. Without bothering to place the chain in position, he made his way down the musty passage to where he knew the opposite gate barred entrance to the warren beneath Lakeside. Once he had reached it, he listened intently for any sign of a patrol or casual passerby. The chain here was not as stout as in the slave cavern, and he made short work of it, not having to take equal care concerning being overheard. He stepped through into the torchlight. The well-remembered passageway opened up before him. He turned to the left and set off at a silent trot. Elena sat in her garden, the fragrance of her flowers fading around her. She stared up at the stars, but saw them not. The bird-song had long disappeared from among the shrubs and trees. Today she had not taken any pleasure in her afternoon visit. The peace and comfort she so often found here had eluded her. No amount of pretense could banish from her mind the images of the sad little smile in the dungeons. No number of good arguments could appease the terrible guilt she felt. And then death and horror had stolen in to mar even her private world. A crow had reached in through the lattice work of her bird cages and killed one of the fledglings. She saw its greedy eye watching her while it stole the precious little life away. The servants had come running at her shout, but it was too late to change the outcome. It was Merric, she thought at once, evil and cruel, destroying the defenseless. She touched the lifeless form and noticed the tears dripping on her hands. Tears from the Queen of Marble, who had no heart but for spite and disdain. What had happened to her? She could not remember when last her emotions had so visibly contradicted her reason. It was Merric, Horan Inronag, who had hardened her like that. It was his coldness, his brutality that had turned her to stone. Yet her fall had not been unwilling. Something told her that she was an easy match for him in cruelty. Did she not have one of her children locked away in the darkness, slowly suffocating in the embrace of the dark stone? Would she accuse the Shadow Lord of corrupting his own issue into abominations, when she would sacrifice as easily for her cause? Nothing remained to her. Not the dream of humbling the warrior lord, not the shaky alliance with his enemy, not even the little life she had gathered to herself in this garden. Black and empty was her heart, and her loneliness complete. She had chosen this way, had fooled herself into believing it to be hers. The boy's voice rang in her ears again, that strange, feverish sound that could not have come from his mouth.
And what will you be in this world? A trophy for his hall, with no more merit or devotion than his favorite hunting dog. In your garden, you will be more alone than you have ever been. There will be no wild hope, no dream of escape, only the weight of your guilt and the memories to haunt you forever.
Forever. This was her prison now, and there would be no escape from it. But she would not have it. Whatever had awakened in her would not be pressed into silent resignation. She would be free, free of Merric's duplicity and Cale's reproaches. She had the right, surely, to choose her own path, to relinquish the pain of uncountable ages, to be separated from her guilt, from dark deeds, from the endless spiral of retribution. A cry broke from her of anguish and frustration, startling the birds in her aviary and bringing a servant running from the doorway in alarm. He halted several paces away, uncertain. Elena rose to her feet. With an effort she composed herself. Her decision was made. To the pit with the consequences. She turned to the staring servant.
Fetch me a physician.
She would not let him die. She would keep him, even if she had to hide him from Merric. The crow would not steal away this life. Rune halted in every doorway that afforded even the least amount of shelter. Here he listened intently before proceeding to the next. He passed the crossroad where he had hid from the pursuing guard so many seasons before. Vividly, he recalled the strange procession of Tuor children and their accompanying priests who had passed this way then. It might just be that Merric and his cronies were still making their strange preparations and performing their dark rituals down here before setting off for the north. There were no sounds he could detect, however, and the further he proceeded, the more his straining nerves were calmed. After perhaps half a mile of gradual descent, he reached the gateway to the temple. Here again he felt the disquiet of disturbing deeds rising from the silent stones, the tiered giant steps, the obscure images lurking on the floor of the arena. The place appeared deserted. Bull lamps indicated the doorways along the upper tier, gaping mouths with their secrets shut away from sight. There would be no opportunity to explore in order to find a more direct route to the dungeons. It would well be much better to follow the way he had stumbled on previously, since no one would expect an intruder to penetrate the fastness of the lakeside underground via the sealed-off slave cavern. There was no reason to patrol any part of the route he was using. Instead of dropping down into the dark pit of the temple arena, he worked his way round the upper rim, careful not to linger in front of any of the doorways. The place was silent as the grave. The faintest noise echoed in the void. A slight draught made the lamps flare. He felt the brush of cold air from below on his cheek. The doorway opposite from the one through which he had entered was veiled in darkness. He stepped into it. There were the lines of robes, priestly garments for their sinister rituals. The sound of conversation reached his ears, and he quickly pressed in among the folds of fabric. It was faint, unintelligible, distant. Perhaps it had come from one of the adjoining passages off the temple. Ahead lay the broken steps leading downwards to the guard room. The third watch had probably commenced. It had to be after midnight. No one would be sitting up gambling or gossiping at this hour. The men there would certainly be asleep, awaiting their turn for duty. Still, he would have to be as stealthy as a cat. One wrong step and he would have to flee the place with his mission unfulfilled. He remembered the doorknob, loose and worn. Gripping it tightly, he turned till the spindle moved slowly, careful not to cause a clicking sound as it pulled back the bolt. The door opened. Again he took the weight of it off the hinges and pushed it wide enough only to allow swift passage. There was no one in the chamber. The tables and benches were empty. The curtained doorway to the adjoining bunk room came into view. It was open. He froze. A figure moved on one of the bunks, turned over and breathed deeply once more. The men here would be marshlanders and not the tour who had eyes for the dark. Low embers glowed in the hearth, bathing the room in a low red illumination. Even if one of them woke and saw him, they could mistake his hooded form for a guard. He crossed the room to the exit through the iron gate. No one ever bothered to shut this, it seemed. He slipped through, breathing an inward sigh of relief. Sleeping guards and guardroom were behind him, undisturbed. The trap door leading to the great hall beneath waited beyond. The ladder was still in place. Rune peered through into the cavern below. It was a fearful place, made so by the huge gateway along one of its walls. He had a clear idea of what was contained here now, having seen one of Lord Malic's monsters close up. Yet the beast of the Dankwood, terrible as it was, had not exuded such a potent malevolence as permeated these lower halls of Merric. As his thought turned to the caged creature, Rune felt an odd touch in his mind, a strange sensation somewhat akin to the invasions of Karth, but decidedly hostile. For an instant he became aware of the scrutiny of Lord Malic, the close inspection he had undergone when confronted by the Master of Lakeside in his palace hall. It lasted but for a moment, yet left him with the ominous thought of having attracted someone's notice. The Queen, he thought. Karth had warned him about the Queen. Or could there be another among the tour's spawn who shared such awareness? Either way, it could mean discovery. He had to hurry. Rune slid down the ladder into the hall below, looking about him for signs of life. As soon as his feet touched the ground, he sprinted for the cavern wall to his right. A single lamp served here as opposed to the torches flanking the heavy gate. He doused it immediately and, placing his back to the packed earth, glanced up and down the hall. The only entrance to the dungeons he was aware of lay off to the right beneath a bright lamp, perhaps 400 yards away. There was no guard as he had expected. Keeping to the shadows, he ran as quietly as his haste permitted. Footfalls echoed through the place, certainly too loud to be his. Men were approaching at a run from somewhere out of sight. He was but 20 yards short of the door, but it would surely be locked. Rune looked about him in consternation. He needed to find concealment or be discovered. There was nothing but the doorway and its brightly blazing lamp. He had seen that door before. The flared hinges, the massive iron nails. Now he would see what horrors it had hid. If he could find a way through, of course. The latch, a twisted rope of copper, turned as he forced it, but the door itself would not give. The gargoyle with its keyhole mouth seemed to laugh at his predicament. He glanced at the heavy lintel above the door. A deep shadow caused by the wide rim shielding the lamplight rose above it. Could he take the risk? If he were discovered here, he would have to fight his way through Malic's legions to escape. Somewhere behind him in the dark, a shouted command rang out. He leaped up, gripped the lintel, and pulled himself onto it. There was very little room. The perch was a precarious one. He dared not stand up. That would expose his head and shoulders to the light. One knee went down on the rim while he gripped the rough wall with his fingertips to keep his balance. A dozen figures appeared round the bend from the direction of the tall gates. They were running in step, marshlanders by the look of them, carrying spears and shields. Rune watched them approach, already aching to shift his position, but not daring to move with only the darkness to protect him. The soldiers halted in front of the door, directly below him. The closest one was only a few feet away. He reached out to pound on the door with his fist and hardly had time to step back before a key sounded in the lock and it was flung open. A huge man, towering over the marshmen, strode out. Rune recognized his complexion and coloring as that of the tour. Another man appeared at his elbow, an unkempt and scruffy fellow, taking 2 steps where the others 1. The big man, reaching out his hand, spoke first.
Where is the message?
The leading warrior answered.
There is no time for writing. It is urgent.
Well,
There is an intruder. Stay on your guard. The Firon exile has dared to come back here.
The big one and the dirty fellow looked at each other. The latter reacted first.
The prince? That's ridiculous.
wait, Gobran, let him speak.
The leader continued.
He is somewhere in the underground, snooping around like he did last time.
How do you know this? He has been seen?
The old priest picked him up.
Gobran looked doubtful.
Czar? He wasn't just dreaming.
The guard snorted.
Would you like to go and ask him?
Gobran shrugged and looked away.
I thought not.
He turned back to the brute.
I leave you 2 more men and go on to secure the western exits.
2 of the warriors stepped out from the squad, and the rest moved off to a doorway in the far wall. Gobran turned to the big one, his expression still skeptical.
Is it him? Does he know the master is here? And all the great ones who will go to battle with him? Emus, will you get your chance to stop him now?
There was a hollow laugh.
There are men enough to stop him, and the Queen knows. You just keep your eyes open.
Why has he come back here? There is nothing more to...
The voice trailed off. The tall tour turned to go. A hand fell on his sleeve. The next words almost caused Rune to lose his grip and fall. In clear tones, the voice of the hunched figure echoed up to him.
Has he come back for the little one? Has he come for his son?
Gobran touched the long knife in his belt.
We should go down and slit his throat right now.
He chuckled loudly.
Even if the job is already half done, I would like to see him squirm.
It was the turn of Imus to sound doubtful.
How would he even know the boy is here?
You forget the vile arts of these filthy Viron. They have senses like old Czar and the Queen. Some of the outcasts still hold on to those.
Imus shrugged.
They will find us more than ready for such trickery.
He beckoned to the 2 men.
I'll take these 2 where they will be of use. You wait here for me.
Rune felt the dizziness wash over him. He closed his eyes and gripped the wall with all his might, till the rough stone turned to sharp pain beneath his gloved fingers. He knew it was true. He had known in his buried soul the first time he had seen that child on Karth's Isle, in that fog-filled courtyard at night. Her voice had warned him, and the eyes filled with such expectation, such undisguised longing. Those final stolen nights in Belruth. Had Aethera hoped to keep something of her lover alive when he would be torn away from her so soon? There would have been no way to hide her treachery. In her desperation to hold on to him, she had condemned herself. As soon as she would give birth in turn to Fengor's son, her secret would be out. And who could be the father of her firstborn but the condemned brother? No wonder they had hated this boy so, and were only too willing to trade his substance to the shadow. Gareth was his. How right it seemed now, how obvious. Fengor's outcast son never belonged to him to begin with. And the filth below him would slit that throat and enjoy doing it. Rune dropped down from the sill, driving his knee into the man's back. He landed on top of him, knocking the wind out of the surprised form. There would be no alarm given. He gripped the greasy hair and chin, twisting with force to snap the worthless neck. There were keys at the man's belt. He could not remember whether the brute Imus had locked the door behind him. A twist of the copper rope and quick shove indicated that he had. There were 5 keys on the ring. The third one turned the lock. It was a large room with a high, domed ceiling. The heavy machines, he remembered, littered the floor space, and one had to pass among them to get to the further end. It was dark just inside the door. A single lamp hung above the inner doorway, some 40 or 50 yards distant. It was suspended in the bluish glass of his dream. As he looked at it, 2 men appeared through the doorway. There was no opportunity to hide. He drew the blade, composing it instantly. Imus of earlier and a guard stopped short at the sight of him, surprise written on their features.
Watch out for that stick!
It was the guard who shouted the warning as he leaped back and drew a curved knife from his belt. The other one merely laughed. He was a big man, this Imus, sure of himself and powerful. Something of his long experience with fighters warned Rune against underestimating this opponent. He pushed back the hood and, ignoring the Marshlander, locked his eyes on the tour. Imus picked a long curved blade from a wall rack. Quickly, a length of chain from one of the counters was partially wrapped around his left wrist and hand. He seemed in no hurry, but did not shift his gaze from his opponent for a moment. When he was satisfied with his armaments, he reached up with a chained fist and smashed the lamp above the door. There was a cry of dismay from the guard. The room was swallowed in the blackest night. Rune crouched down as he heard the swishing of the chain. His eyes had barely adjusted before the massive tour was upon him. He scurried behind the scattered objects to avoid the assault. The first blows fell harmlessly on a tall engine with outstretched wooden arms, one of which splintered under the impact. The whistling blade followed immediately, lodging itself into a stout beam. The sheer power behind these blows convinced Rune not to attempt blocking them. He had difficulty in following the sweep of the chain in the dark. It was apparent that the tour was playing to his own strengths, trying to neutralize what he knew of his opponent's advantages. The Marslander was crouching behind a bench, trying to stay out of the way. He was blind in the blackness and would not know friend from foe. Rune knocked him hard on the side of the head in passing, and he sagged down without making a noise. Imus took advantage of this diversion by attacking with lightning speed. Rune, ducking under the wild sweeps of the chain, was driven into the relative open beyond the machines towards the exit. The broken glass of the smashed lamp cracked under his boots. The spilt oil caused him to slip, and he went down on one knee, feeling the shards penetrate through his hose. Imus moved in for the kill. His sword arm came down with all his might behind it. But the Viron champion of 1,000 matches had rolled away and retreated beyond his reach. The curved blade struck the stone floor in a shower of sparks. The chain followed, allowing no gap for a counterattack. They faced each other, breathing heavily. There was no way of reading intentions in the eyes of the opponent. The darkness made feinting and probing far more lethal. Rune assessed the situation. He would have to get inside the man's longer reach to deal him a death blow. No doubt Imus would tire ere long if Rune could stay out of his way, but a long struggle would weaken him and lessen his chances of escape dramatically. The chain came lashing out after him once more as Imus launched another attack. It was a ferocious assault, a supreme effort from the giant, aimed at ending the fight in his favor. Blow followed blow, driving back his opponent, relentless, without slowing or abatement, till Rune found his back pressed against the wall. Here he had to turn the other's blade with his, and his quick turn away from the tight place cost him a glancing blow from the chain to the left arm. Immediately the limb went numb, throbbing from elbow to fingertips. He gritted his teeth. This tour was becoming a problem. Imus had turned to pursue his adversary. Now Rune did the unexpected and slammed his shoulder right into the man. There was no opportunity for Imus to block with his arms, engaged as they were with wielding his weapons. The chained hand came round to grip Rune's body and hold it to his. In close quarters like this, he could crush the life out of the smaller enemy, but he never had the chance. Rune quickly thrust the blade under his own left armpit and into the exposed body of his opponent. The weight of the other's arm dragged him down on top of the falling body. The curved sword clattered to the floor behind them. Rune rolled free and slowly rose to his feet. The big man lay motionless. The blade had entered his ribs and moved upwards, piercing his heart. A good death, Rune thought, for a worthy opponent. There had been no trickery or foul play, even if the Tuor believed they had an advantage in the dark. He retrieved his weapon and walked over to the recumbent form of the marshman, fervently hoping he had not struck him too hard. A few slaps brought the man back to consciousness, moaning to himself. Rune hissed into his ear.
No tricks now, and no noise, or I cut your throat here and now. If you want to live, you will lead me to the cell of the Viron boy you took in Mundborg.
There was a moment's hesitation before the reply came.
I cannot see a thing. How will I lead you?
Rune shook him roughly.
Don't get clever. You will tell me, and I will direct you. Do we go through that door by which you entered?
Yes, the door. And then just follow the passage down onto the platform. There is a lift to lower you to the cells.
Rune yanked the man to his feet, but had to prevent him from sagging back down.
Show me,
he whispered.
And hold your tongue, or you will be a corpse before you can draw a second breath.
He contracted the blade and pressed the tip into the man's back, making sure he broke the skin. There was a sharp intake of breath, but no outcry. The fellow was alert enough to be afraid. Beyond the doorway there was light enough for his captive to cease his stumbling. There were no guards to challenge them, and they proceeded to the platform and stepped out onto it. Rune stared at the cavern below. The sheer extent of it was startling. As far as he could see, torches flared on stone walls above gates of iron, barring the way further into the warren of tunnels and crypts. How many prisoners did the madman of Tiralon keep in this place? How much would it cost his poor kingdom just to keep them alive? The man with him seemed to understand the working of the mechanism attached to the platform, for he started pulling on a rope without being instructed, and they commenced the descent. It appeared to be a simple enough system of pulleys and counterweights, making the passage almost effortless. The cavern floor was about 40 feet below. Just before they reached it, a cry went up somewhere among the myriad of tunnels. It was long and drawn, a voice of despair and failing reason. Even the marshlander shuddered at the sound. The platform thudded into the dungeon floor.
Where to now?
Rune's whisper betrayed his impatience. The man reached up to nurse the side of his head. He pointed with his other hand.
Through there, the second gate, and then some ways.
Rune gripped his shoulder from behind, holding him at arm's length, and steered him in the direction he had indicated. It turned out to be quite the distance, perhaps a mile, before the fellow halted in front of a heavy door.
This is it.
Rune felt a prickling up his spine. Could it be a trick? There was no number on the cell door. How had the man known to bring him exactly here without hesitation?
How do you know?
He shrugged.
I work here, day in and day out. I know where all the important ones are kept. And this one we had to fetch quite often.
There was really no choice. He would have to check the cell to make sure. He shoved the man up to the door.
Draw back the bolt,
he commanded.
Open the door.
The wooden door creaked as it swung back on its hinges. A rectangle of pale light appeared on the stone floor of the cell. All was quiet. Rune could make out some sacking to one side next to an overturned pail. The shape of a small body lay prostrate beyond it. Could it be Gareth?
You first.
He pushed the man through the doorway and into the semi-dark. They had hardly proceeded 3 paces when assailants fell upon them from both sides. The poor fellow in front was run through instantly and sagged to the floor wailing. Rune leaped forward, trying to evade the steel blade leveled at him. He lost his footing in a furrow and fell full length. There was a rush of clothing and the scrape of steel as the men closed in. He was up almost immediately, the blade ready in his hand. There were only 2 of them. By their appearance, the ones Immos had brought below earlier. This was what he had planned for them then. The warriors came at him from both sides, swinging their swords wildly. Now that the element of surprise had been lost, they no longer had any advantage. Their desperate attack availed them little. He hardly needed to parry a blow before they joined their hapless comrade on the cell floor. Rune wiped his blade on their clothing before returning it to its sheath. He would need another guide to find Gareth's cell if the boy was still in the dungeons at all. The pity the wretch who had led him here had been killed. He turned to go. Yet there was still a 4th body on the floor, smaller than the others, lying face down. Had the fool brought him to the right place after all? Had they set up their ambush in the very cell he sought? Quickly he knelt down next to the silent form. The wrists and ankles were not shackled. There was no need. A little shock passed through him. It was the boy, still and lifeless, missing his doublet and boots, a blood stain between his shoulders and down his spine. Had Imus come down here to do what the scummy Gogrand had suggested? Surely there had not been enough time for that. Perhaps the guards he had sent here had been instructed. He rolled the boy over. His shirt was dirty and torn down the front. Something had been fastened round his neck, an object of metal like a collar. There was no blood here. He pressed his ear to the mouth, praying to nameless gods in unknown places. He could hear shallow breathing and felt the warmth on his cheek. Gareth was alive. Rune shook him gently by the shoulder, but there was no response. He realized that if all the commotion of the struggle so close by had not roused the boy, he was not likely to be woken up by these means. Something warned him, though, not to treat the unconscious form too roughly. Gareth would have to be carried. He had been prepared for this, but it was a long way back to the city wall and safety beyond. The guards were aware of him, even if they did not know exactly where he was. It would not be as simple to get out as it had been to sneak in. Rune removed his hooded cloak and draped it round Gareth's shoulders. The boy's fair hair and dirty white shirt would easily be spotted if they were forced to hide from sight. The dark garment only reached to his knees, but he was dressed in black from the waist down. He tore a strip from the ragged shirt, rolled him over again, and tied his wrists lightly behind his back. This would keep the arms from slipping out from under the cloak when he was carried. Rune drew the hood over the boy's head and picked him up. It would be easiest to drape the body over his shoulder. All was prepared. He paused to listen. No alarm had been raised. Fortune had smiled on him thus far. Rune moved out into the passageway. The incredible gamble was still on. He walked at a quick pace, conserving his energy for an unforeseen crisis. It was hard to imagine, even after the confrontations that had brought him here, that he would be allowed simply to walk out of the place. Would the old priest Czar still be aware of him? Would he be able to tell whether he was alive or dead? All speculation, he told himself, faced that problem if it materialized. He reached the platform and dropped the boy onto it to free his arms for the ascent. Slowly they creaked their way to the top. All the while the sensation of being watched grew stronger and stronger, till he gripped the hilt of his blade, turning this way and that to ward off possible assailants. The platform slammed into the crossbar at the top without interruption or incident. He waited breathlessly, frozen with apprehension. There was no sound, no movement anywhere. He picked up the body and set off once more. Up the passage they went, through the doorway to the torture chamber, crunching over the broken glass, slipping over the body of the large Tour, picking their way among the engines of terror. At last the doorway loomed. They were leaving the dungeons behind. Here was probably the greatest danger. The 400 yards to the guard room ladder offered no hiding place. If guards entered through any doorway, they would be spotted almost immediately and have no place of retreat but the dungeons. Rune set off along the wall once more, moving as quickly as he could, his heartbeat drumming in his ears. The place was eerily quiet. Even the creature beyond the gates had to be asleep. The only things audible were his own breathing and hurrying footfalls. They reached the ladder. All seemed quiet beyond the trapdoor. Were the guards up there still asleep, or had they been called out? Would he climb up only to find them waiting? Rune lingered a few moments to catch his breath, all the while watching the dark gaping hole above. Was there a flicker of light, some slight movement? A distant shout from down the hall turned his head violently. Several figures were close to the dungeon door. One of them was pointing in his direction. He scurried up the rungs as fast as he could, not waiting to see if they were coming after him. He crawled through the gap and staggered to his feet, gasping for breath. The sound was horribly loud in the enclosed space. The iron gate helped him regain his balance. He shifted the body from one shoulder to the other and pressed into the guard room. Several forms were moving about in the bunk room. A lamp had been lit and placed on a table. It could be time for the third watch to go on duty. Rune strode through the room without turning his head. A voice was raised in question, but he ignored it. Before anyone else could react, he had opened the outer door and disappeared through it. He was up the twisting stairs and into the priest's dressing chamber with but a few long strides. The guards in the cavern below would not waste any time in coming after him up the ladder. That would multiply the number of pursuers once they enlisted the aid of the men he just left behind. The priestly robes lined the wall of the smaller chamber. He was tempted to don one as a disguise, but they were light in color and would be spotted easily in a crowd. The deception would not last, and only jeopardize his flight when uncovered. Swiftly he passed through into the temple. Here he was brought up short by an unexpected sight. Cursing himself for his haste, Rune realized that he could not have remained in the chamber in any case, with pursuers so close behind. 4 figures, 2 of whom carried torches, were making their way round the upper tier in his direction. They had seen him, being but 20 paces away, and had halted in consternation. Elena saw the dark, bulging figure emerge from the doorway ahead. A shock passed through her. This place was haunted with so many of Malic's misdeeds. For a moment she believed one of his perversions had taken on substance and would leap out upon them in predatory malice. Copper eyes flashed at her in the torchlight. The figure gained an outline and definition. It was a man, carrying something, or someone. He was a stranger, not of the tour or any subject race, with an emanation of powerful purpose about him. Who was he? Where had he come from? The eyes were upon her still, challenging, protective. She understood. It was Kael's champion, Rune, the son of Alborad, Comfrey's son. Relief, satisfying, startling, like the rising sun took hold of her. She was too late, but in time to see this act of atonement, and it witnessed in her heart as her own a moment of exhilarating release. Her 2 guards moved forward to interpose themselves between her and the stranger who was Rune.
Stay back!
She hissed at them.
Into the passage!
They followed her direction without hesitation. Both knew from rumor alone the potency of their queen. She would not need them in dealing with any potential threat. Yet she made no move to treat them to an exhibition. She merely stood there, an expression of surprise and delight on her face. Perhaps she knew the stranger in black. He brought her an unexpected message, perchance. Rune took a few apprehensive steps away from the curious little group. His hand was on the hilt of his blade, but he made no move to draw it. If he could make his escape without raising their suspicion, it would serve him much better than a confrontation. Any delay here could cost him everything. He moved round the rim on the opposite side of the temple cavern, watching the strange woman and her following closely. Rune did not miss the odd expression on her face, nor the inexplicable instruction for her men to exit the cavern through one of the far doorways. Who was she? Could it be the queen he had been warned about? Then why was she letting him go? Did she have a trap set somewhere else? It made little sense. Elena watched the man and his burden till he had made his way around the far wall and stepped through another doorway.
Yes, fly away, little bird.
She whispered after him.
Fly away and grow strong again.
The elation she felt was an opiate to her weary mind. There would be no reckoning for this crime then, for she had been willing to change the outcome, and now she had participated in the undoing of it. His legs were growing tired, and his breathing was heavy, always working his way upward through the never-ending passages. There were voices from doorways and hidden side tunnels, urgent voices, shouting instructions, questioning, commanding. Surely they were after him, the hordes of marshland guards in Malic's underground. By the time he reached the first of the iron gates to the slave cavern, he was worn out. He crept into the darkness and put down the limp form next to him. A few moments to catch his breath. A terrible thirst had taken hold of him. If only he could find some water, it would revive him. There was a chance that the men who were after him had lost his trail. They had not seen him exiting from the temple. There were many doorways leading from it. Unless the strange woman had directed them, it would be impossible for them to guess which one he had used. Slowly, he gained control over his runaway breathing. A faint stir in the air moved over his sweating face, cooling him. Oh, for a drink of water! There was a well in the slave market, but where would he leave the boy? It was too risky. The alarm might well have been sounded outside in the city, with patrols scouring the streets for a Viron in a black cloak. He stirred into action. Sitting about would not profit him anything. Footfalls came hurrying up the underground passage. Rune gripped the boy round the chest and pulled him into the deep shadow. He pressed himself against the wall and waited. 3 men passed, not even glancing in his direction. He breathed again and leaned his head back. One last effort was required. Through the market and the dark streets, over the wall and away from this pool of corruption. Where he would stop he had little idea. All that mattered now was to put as many miles between himself and none Merric as possible. Sighing deeply, he took up the burden again and stumbled up the passage to the slave cavern. Here things seemed as before. Either they did not suspect that he had used this way to gain entrance, or the general alarm had not been given. If they believed him to be in the crypt still, they would concentrate their search there. He slipped out among the cages, treading carefully. A few pairs of eyes watched his progress from behind the cage bars, but their owners made no effort to address or arrest him. Maybe they had been robbed of the ability, having had their tongues removed, like a good proportion of the slaves in the swamplands. Rune watched for guards in the exit tunnel, but only the dozing man of earlier remained on duty at the gate. He had to be assigned there for the entire night. No wonder he was asleep. The outer gate had been shut, but it appeared unlocked, the chain dangling free. He opened it hastily, eager to be free of the close, confining threat of the underground. The hinges complained loudly, waking the slouching guard. Burdened as he was, Rune could not act swiftly to silence him. In a moment the eyes and mouth were as wide as they could go. Out poured the cry of indignation and challenge. Perhaps he believed Rune was carrying off one of his precious slaves. This was not the time to stay and argue the point. He had to run for it. Incredibly, there were still people around the flames of braziers in the square at this hour. Most were incapacitated, but several stirred at the sudden shouting from the pit entrance. 2 or 3 even set off in pursuit, having made out the dark, encumbered figure fleeing in the torchlight. Rune cursed the wretches. They were no threat by themselves, but he was tempted to halt and deal with them. Their loud pursuit would bring down a patrol on him sooner or later, and once he reached the wall he would certainly be accosted by the roaming guard there. There might be sufficient delay to bring out numbers of warriors after him. He sprinted away through the gateway, tearing down the streets to where he had left the rope under the walkway. The strain of it had him gasping before long, and he felt the strength draining from his legs. The drunken sots from the market kept up their shouting and feeble running, as if it were some kind of entertainment. If he was trapped, he promised himself, they would be the first to die. Another shout, and the running feet of guards sounded from a side street. It could not be true, he thought. He could not get this close only to be trapped now. Just ahead waited the wall, and beyond it he was away free. But already he could not force enough air into his lungs. The body he carried seemed to have multiplied in weight. There was no one on the walkway. He thanked whoever was looking out for him. The rope was still there. He grabbed it quickly, looped the tied end over a stake in the palisade. A man came running towards him from the direction of a watchtower, trying to cut him off. The guards below had already reached the wall. Gripping the rope tightly, he stepped over the side, almost slipping and impaling himself on the sharp points. It was not a long way down, but if he jumped he could easily hurt an ankle or knee, and the game would be up. The man had a bow, Rune realized, even as his feet touched the ground. The running watchman had halted 20 paces down the walkway. He fitted an arrow into the weapon and leaned over the palisade. Rune cringed as he turned to stumble away through the dry moat. How could he possibly miss at that range? There were more shouts from the wall. The others had found his rope. A missile whistled through the air. Instinctively he turned his free shoulder to absorb the impact. But the man had been over-eager and overshot his mark in the dark. The arrow lodged itself harmlessly in the compacted soil. They were coming after him, down the wall on his rope. Perhaps they sensed his state of weariness. Perhaps they considered the burden he was carrying would slow him down. He gained the far side of the moat and somehow made it to the top of the embankment. How much longer could he keep it up? The uneven terrain made running difficult. Sooner or later, Rune stumbled and came down on his cut knee. Through the fatigue, he hardly noticed the pain. It was hopeless. There was no way he could keep the boy and shake off his pursuers. He had to choose, leave him behind or be taken with him. Perhaps Gareth was already beyond any help and would not survive even if carried away. What good would it do to perish here? If he survived, he could perchance try again to free the boy. It would be wise to leave him behind for the guards. He sobbed up at the sky. Was this all he could do to pay his great debt? Is this all that was required, that he made the attempt? Could his soul be free now? His dream would end here in the sands of Taralan. He rolled the boy off his shoulder and into the dust. He looked back at the sprawling city. The guards were in the moat, closing in. Could he fight them off to gain time? Already there were torches on the wall, and shouted instructions rose up into the night. He gripped the blade and looked down at the silent figure. Rune knew in his heart that he could not abandon the boy again, not even if he was dead already. Here he would stand and be slaughtered. They would be united in death if they could not share another day of life. He drew the blade and composed it under the eager starlight, trying to slow the wild gallop in his chest. More marshmen, awakened by the shouting and excitement, were rushing over from the tents outside the walls. He gritted his teeth and waited. Behind him was the rustling of a body passing through the dried-out grass and the stomping of heavy feet. He turned swiftly to answer this new threat. A familiar sound pierced the night, the whinnying of a horse. He stared at the animal, astonished. It was the same huge form he had sent back to the pass and Fenvale that afternoon.
Guilt?
He held out a hand. The horse came forward willingly. It was riderless. Perhaps it had not been able to find its way back, and the Viron sent after it had not discovered its whereabouts because it had turned round to follow its former master. It mattered little. They were saved. He gathered the boy up and placed him in the seat. No marshlander would catch them with this swift mount. There was no longer any doubt that they were gods who favored his venture this night.